mid-90s, game development was changing. For all the great games present on SNES and Mega Drive, 2D games were starting to lose some of their luster. People wanted fully 3D games instead of faking the effects in things like Star Fox, Pilot Wings, or the original Mario Kart. Seriously, looking at this for long enough gives me a chronic migraine. Sony was new to the industry after their failed experiment with Nintendo to make a CD add-on for Super Nintendo, but the PlayStation dominated everything in this period, with hardware that was easier to develop for and a big install base that attracted a lot of third-party support. However, that didn't stop people from having a curiosity what was going on with Nintendo 64 and its powerful first-party games. As for Sega Saturn, no one cared. A massive issue Nintendo had with the N64 was the decision to still rely on cartridges rather than CDs. They couldn't hold anywhere near enough space as the discs used by PlayStation, which killed almost all third-party support, except for Rareware. One of the biggest years in gaming was right in the middle of this console generation, 1998. So many great games were released during this year, both new IPs and sequels to some already brilliant titles. Things like Metal Gear Solid, Resident Evil 2, StarCraft, Mario Party, Sonic Adventure, Fallout 2, Spyro the Dragon, Crash Bandicoot 3, Half-Life, and finally, Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time. Ocarina of Time is the fourth best-selling game for the console, only behind Super Mario 64, which was a launch title, Mario Kart 64, and GoldenEye 007. Not to mention it was the best selling in the series until Twilight Princess came out, only for them to take that crown back when 3DS port took it to 13 million copies. But the legacy of Ocarina of Time goes beyond sales. It tossed the series into 3D, transformed the genre of action-adventure games, and inspired so many other games for decades after its release. It released on November 21st, 1998 in Japan, November 26th in NTSC regions, and on December 11th before it came to the dreary beaches of Britain. And so, without further waiting, let us finally review Ocarina of Time. Our first 3D journey put us back in the land of Hyrule, albeit one step before every other game so far. Timeline-wise, we've gone forward and back with every other game. As soon as the game starts, we see a man on a horse chasing after a young Princess Zelda and her guardian Impa, all inside our hero's dream. Meanwhile, the Great Deku Tree has summoned the fairy Navi to seek out the boy in the Kokiri forest and bring him to meet with the tree to explain his role in the events surrounding Hyrule. When Link finally wakes up, he heads outside and speaks to his close friend Saria for a brief moment before going to see the Deku Tree. However, as soon as you try, the great Gimp Mido blocks the path, or letting you through when you get the Kokiri sword and the Deku shield. Gathering your equipment, you can finally speak to the wooden giant. The Great Deku Tree tells Link of his new responsibilities in defeating Ganondorf, who has placed a curse upon the tree, allowing Link to go inside of him to clear our first dungeon. For the first 3D Zelda dungeon, they really couldn't have done much of a better job. It's simple, sure, but it's meant to be, and gives Link the slingshot, which is a good way to teach the player how to use its Z targeting. But it turns out, none of that mattered, because the tree dies anyway. But before the tree passes away, he gives our hero his next instructions and a retelling of the Hyrule origin story, that the goddesses Din, Nero and Faeror quit land of Hyrule along with the aid of the Triforce. He gives Link the Kokiri Emerald and tells him to head to Hyrule Castle, warning him that Ganondorf cannot enter the Sacred Realm at any cost. Upon trying to exit the forest, Saria stops Link to give him the Fairy Ocarina, to play songs and remind him of his life in the woods. This is a nice moment and shows Link's willingness to leave his home behind to embark on his quest. Crossing over Hyrule Field to make it to the castle, Link meets with the child Zelda after a forced stealth segment, which is completely necessary by the way, and tells Link she had a very similar dream to what Link had at the start of the game, and teaches him his first Ocarina song. She is concerned about the man we know as Ganondorf, and wants Link to gather the rest of the spiritual stones, thinking that they could, in some way, prevent Ganondorf from taking power. Off to Death Mountain, the Gorons, led by the Chief Darunia, make their debut in Zelda by being slowly starved to death. The Gorons are my favourite characters in Zelda. The areas and dungeons tend to be really enjoyable, and there's a fair amount of character to them. The Dongo's Cavern is the game's second dungeon, and while not as good as the first, has a nice way of looping back round to the centre room before progressing to the boss. Not to mention that bombs are always useful. After clearing out the Dongo's Cavern, the Gorons can finally eat. Link acquires the Goron Ruby, and only the Stone of Water remains. Zora's Domain is next, and these guys have had one hell of a facelift when jumping to 3D, and it was a brilliant redesign of the fish people. We meet the King Zora and help his daughter Ruto, who's trapped inside Jabby Jabby's belly. I hate this place. For over half the dungeon, you transport Ruto through it, who is rather annoying at this part of the game. The puzzles aren't really challenging, and the overall design is rather disturbing. You're walking through the digestive system of a big fish, and the walls pulsate in time with the music. At least the boss fight is decent. As a reward for this, Ruto gives you the Zora Sapphire, which is apparently meant to act like an engagement ring for the young Zora. But with all stones collected, the sky around Hyrule Castle Town darkens, with Link's nightmare coming true. Ganondorf has seized control over Hyrule Castle, with Zelda and Nipper barely escaping, throwing you the treasure needed to enter the Sacred Realm, Ocarina of Time itself. By using Ocarina of Time, Link opens a path to the Master Sword and removes it from its pedestal, sending Link 7 years into the future. Sage of Light, Rauru, tells Link he was kept sealed away for 7 years to mature to the point where he could successfully challenge Ganondorf. But during that time, Ganondorf pretty much runs the world now, with the rest of the sages locked up inside their temples. To stand any chance against the King of Evil, Link must free those sages. Before we can leave the Temple of Time though, a mysterious fellow named Sheik gives us a warning to go to Kakariko village to get the secret treasure of the Sheikah clan, and then head to the Forest Temple first. This item is the hookshot and can attach itself to pretty much any wooden surface. Crossing through each dungeon, each sage is someone Link already knows from his time as a child. Saria, Darunia, Ruto, Impa and Nabooru. The first temple is probably my favourite dungeon in the game. The Phantom Ganon boss fight is cool, the bow is again very useful, shifting rooms and pathways make exploring it fun, and it rescues Link's friend Saria from Ganon. Speaking of Ganon, he also intends to feed the Gorons to a volcano dragon for not giving in to him, and as such, the Fire Temple is present, with Dunya telling you to rescue the rest of the Gorons while he deals with the boss. It's a fine enough dungeon I guess, but the drop off from the previous temple is noticeable. Only the item and boss are things I can take away from it. But now with the Gorons all free, you have the Ice Cavern and Water Temple to follow. Ice Cavern is really a nothing mini dungeon. It takes 10 minutes and you get some steel cap shoes from it. Not horrible, but just not needed. The Water Temple, however, is infamous for being a bad Zelda dungeon. And while I don't think it's terrible, it goes with Jabu Jabu as my least favourite dungeon. It's annoying to always have to go in and out of the menu to equip and unequip the iron boots. And changing the water level is a constant pain, having to go back and forth between the right one. And the boss is bland and forgettable on top of that. In its favour, it does have the best mini-boss, being Dark Link's Return, and is the most non-linear of all the dungeons. The Shire Temple is preceded by another main dungeon, but this one is actually good, if a little short. In the bottom of the well, you play as young Link for the first time in a good while at this point, and the decor of this area is fascinating. There's massive skeletons, torture devices, and blood splattered all over the floors. Not to mention that the boss, Dead Hand, is a dead yet sentient sack of meat smashed together. Coming back as adult Link, with the Lens of Truth, gives us the Shadow Temple. In all, it's very linear, gory glory. This is a very one-track dungeon, with not many optional rooms to explore, and even reuses the boss from under the well as a mini-boss. I enjoy this place, but more freedom would have been nice. And finally, the Spirit Temple, where you play as both Links to beat it. First as a 10-year-old, and then as someone who can actually deal damage. Seriously, young Link's damage output is abysmal. Heading to this place with young Link is made slightly harder because of the lack of damage you can deal. But adult Link has to fight 3 Iron Knuckles, which hit like tanks, so it bounces out. What is a shame though, is that in order to reach this place, you must do another annoying stealth segment. This time to reach some carpenters from the newly introduced Gerudo tribe. As this is likely the first time you meet the Gerudo, it's not a good first impression. As for the tribe themselves, they're an all-female race of thieves that only have one male every 100 years. Who is the most recent male? Ganondorf! But with the Spirit Temple now under our belts, all dungeons are now complete, except for one optional main dungeon. The Gerudo training ground is a rather meaningless place that you don't even need to do. It's more a string of challenges you have to overcome to get keys and open doors. It doesn't have a boss fight, with the reward being just ice arrows that are incredibly situational. And with that, all the sages are rescued, and it's time for one last showdown with the King of Darkness himself. But pause. If you're counting, we rescued 5 sages, and Rauru is a 6th. So who's the other one? Well, back in Temple of Time, she reveals her true identity to Link, that being Princess Zelda, who if you remember, like A Link to the Past, is a 7th sage. Why she reveals her identity here, and not after killing Ganondorf, I guess we'll never know. In fact, it's due to this that she is captured by Ganondorf, and now Link must take Ganondorf down, not only to save Hyrule, but also to free Zelda. Ganon's tower has a pretty good atmosphere, and the latter half, where you sprint down the tower with Zelda, is really enjoyable. However, the first part lets it down. It just recycles various puzzles from early in the game, rather than making its own challenges. When you reach Ganondorf, it's time for a tennis match. Winning this battle of Dead Man's Volley, Ganondorf gets so angry, he tears the entire castle down to the ground, and transforms into the beast Ganon for one more fight. A quick stab to the head, with the Blade of Evil's Bane, sees the adventure come to a close. Ganondorf is sealed away, Hyrule is restored, and Zelda even sends Link back in time to relive the 7 years that he lost, whilst also inadvertently splitting the timeline in 3 ways. But more on that next time. For now, the credits roll and Ocarina of Time story is over. Now personally, while I didn't think Link to the Past story wasn't bad, I did feel as though it could be more fleshed out. Ocarina of Time was well enough in my opinion for the first 3 Zelda of its type. There is more of a personality to the people you see in Hyrule now. And I think the third dimension really helps to portray emotion more than an SNES game. We get to know the sages early in the game before being tasked to save them, whereas Link to the Past had to save the identical looking woman trapped in some dusty old ruins. And the villain has much more of a presence here, with us actually getting to see him before the final battle, or when you die like in Zelda 2. By the time we get into the future, all regions of Hyrule are flooded with monsters, and the people we saw living in that area are either displaced, subjugated or dead, but I do feel like progression of the story stutters long at points, mainly between adult Link's dungeons. Not much happens during this time other than you moving from dungeon to dungeon to rescue the next sage. I am also a little disappointed we don't see Sheik do as much as she could. I know they wanted the dramatic reveal right at the end, but I feel that weakens Sheik's character a bit for the sake of continuing the story. Speaking of that, let's stop and talk about anything else. For the first game in a 3D environment, it controls really well, even if using the 3-pronged dong of a controller on N64. Moving Link has a good weight and momentum to it. Items are assigned to the C button or left analog stick depending on the version you play. A is mapped to the sword and the right shoulder button raises the shield to block incoming attacks. Pausing the game brings up the item screen, which can be changed to look at your equipment, status and the map by pressing the shoulder buttons within that menu. But one of the game's newest features is by far and away the thing that steals the show here: lock-on targeting. Pressing the Z button, Link keeps his gaze and the camera tied to an enemy, making attacking and fighting so much easier. In 1998, this was one of the showstoppers, and a feature so many other games after it would take inspiration from and use. And for what I'm pretty sure is the first use of this technology in a 3D game, well, it certainly works. Looking onto enemies is super smooth. The issue comes when there's more than one enemy close to Link. In order to cancel Z targeting, you have to press the Z button again, which cycles round to the next enemy if it's too close. And then instead of cancelling the attack, it just cycles back round and round until you're far enough away. And this can be quite annoying in dungeons, which already have tight enclosed spaces, making it somewhat challenging to get away from enemies in time. It's not too big of a deal, just annoying in some areas. What is also annoying is Link's running speed and jumping. The platforming in this game is its worst feature. It's incredibly slow, and unless you are dead on with your jumping, there's a 50% chance that you miss the platform entirely and careen into the abyss. As for running, in hub areas or dungeons, it's not a problem because you're gonna take it slower, but when crossing Hyrule Field, the fastest mode of transport is running fucking backwards. Do you know the first thing I do when I get to play as adult Link? Get the horse. Yes, for the first time in a Zelda game, Link can gallop across Hyrule mounted to Epona, which is a goddamn lifesaver when the other option is rolling across half the game world. As for the world itself, it's definitely the easiest to remember. Each location has something about it that sticks out, be it the graveyard in Kakariko Village, the Lost Woods in the Kokiri Forest, Goron City, Zur's Domain. Hyrule Castle Town is filled with people that offer minigames or things to sell, and being connected to the castle itself and the Temple of Time. The only areas that I feel are letdowns are the Gerudo Desert, which only serves as passage to the last temple, and Hyrule Field itself. The only point of interest here is Lon Lon Ranch, which has more character in its chickens than in the field itself. But when you're not trekking across Hyrule Field, you'll find yourself inside a dungeon, which vary from bad, easy, brilliant and bad. The 3 early dungeons, as young Link, are simple introductory areas that teach the player mechanics they'll need later, except for Jabba Jabba's belly. Aside from being an escort mission half the time, it is rather forgettable, but the temples as adult Link can be some of the best dungeons in the series, in the case of the Forest and Spirit Temple, or, the longest thing in the world, the Water Temple. Kind of weird that the worst 2 dungeons in the game are both in the water areas. I'm sure that will continue in future games. Dungeons, like before, have a rigid structure to them, of getting the map, compass and item before fighting the boss, separated by puzzles that can be a challenge if you aren't really paying attention. I really like using both young Link and adult Link for the last 2 temples, and the rotating rooms in the first temple may not make much sense, but is fun to travel through. Bosses and mini-bosses appear in pretty much every dungeon, with the mini-boss usually being pathetic, except for the eye-knuckles in the Spirit Temple and Dark Link's Return in the Water Temple. Main bosses, on the other hand, tend to use the dungeon's item well to find its weakness and exploiting it to smack it around. However, once you know its pattern, bosses become rather easy and predictable. The two best bosses in the game are Twin Rover and Bongo Bongo, but even they're easy with Twin Heart Containers and the Bigoron Sword. Link's inventory has seen a bit of an upgrade to previous titles. You can now assign 3 items to any button on the C-stick, with the sword and shield being separated. Certain items can only be used by one version of Link, such as Deku Sticks and Slingshot for young Link, or the bow for adult Link, while some items, like bombs and potions, can be used by either. While as adult Link, you also get some tunic variation, and unlike before, where your damage or defense are increased, the red and blue tunics are used for fire and water resistance in Death Mountain and Zora's Domain respectively. As for what are the better items, bombs are always useful in Hyrule, much like the hookshot and bow or slingshot, whilst on the other side of the spectrum we have things like the fire and ice arrows, which are so unnecessary that I actually forgot they were a thing until I got the light arrows before Ganon's Tower. But what about the game's namesake, Ocarina? While as young Link, you get the Fairy Ocarina and Ocarina of Time before you travel to the future, but they both function the same. Similar to its use in Link's Awakening, you learn a series of songs along your quest to use at various times. Only here, you have to actually play the song in a short sequence. For the N64 and 3DS version, this is as simple as pressing notes correctly, while the GameCube and Virtual Console drive me insane. This may be a bit hard to explain, so bear with me. For the N64 version, the song inputs use the C buttons for notes, and it doesn't translate well to a control stick. It is super sensitive, and has misread a number of my inputs, forced me to restart the song again. So just be careful of that if you play the game on those systems. Anyway, the songs you play can have a variety of different effects, like calling a opponent to your side, changing between night and day, or teleporting to dungeon entrances. One of the most fun things I like to do in this game is collect all the hidden items, bottles, heart pieces, and upgrades. And if you know how to do some clever jumps, you can get a couple of them way earlier than you should be able to. I spent about 4 hours of my entire playthrough for this video building my inventory as young Link before I even set foot in the Temple of Time, collecting upgrades, playing minigames like bomb cheat balling, fishing on the shooting gallery, or doing one of the side quests you are offered. Unlike before, you can now help people with matters completely unrelated to the main quest. The first of which is the Happy Mask quest, which rewards you with the Mask of Truth, allowing you to talk to Gossip Stones for information on puzzles or secrets, as well as mine upgrades to Link's Deku Sticks and Slingshot. A good distraction, but not majorly rewarding. The Gold Skill Tooler quest is only rewarding for half of it, with the rest being useless. By killing these gilded arachnids and getting their tokens, you can redeem them for rewards of varying importance, such as wallet upgrades and a heart piece. But once you get to 50, it stops until you double that to 100 for infinite money you will never need. And do you all know what that sounds like when you have no money in your inventory? Okay, here you go! The last major side quest is the Bigoron Trading Quest, which is a long trading sequence with various timed objectives rewarding you finally with a sword doubling strength to the Master Sword. This is a pretty good reward for all that pointless backtracking. It annihilates bosses and enemies alike, and the only trade-off is you can't equip the shield. Speaking of good rewards, progressing this game is worth it just to listen to some of that masterful music. The Hyrule Field theme is a classic, dungeon music, like the Shadow and Forest Temple, are atmospheric and fitting for the area. And my personal favourite track is Gerudo Valley, especially its Smash Bros remix. What isn't anywhere near as good though is this game's visuals. Not a single game on N64 has aged well in looks. It's so flat and blocky it may as well be made out of Lego. The Great Deku Tree looks more like a nasty turd. Ingo has 2 giant black caterpillars for eyebrows, and King Zora, oh dear. And you know what? The promotional art for the characters is really bloody brilliant. It's just a shame the N64 has crippling dementia and can't remember what it had for lunch that day. Aside from the visuals, this game's handholding can be quite distracting. Navi constantly moans at you to list your next objective, which you would already know if you paid attention to the story, and it's often considered to be annoying. But you know what's worse? This fucking owl. Kaepora Gaebora returns from Link's Awakening, and I wish he stayed in that dreamland like everything else. Unlike Navi, which you can skip through quickly and never hear from again, this old bastard will completely pause the game for sometimes over a minute and even tricks you into playing the same dialogue over again. All that for information you would have already skipped through, and always for something you definitely knew prior to encountering him. And you can't avoid him either, as he sits like a ninja over the area you have to pass through, ready to pop out and slice you with relevant bullshit. Another misstep, I believe, is that from this point onwards, the series will take a much more linear approach than before, which is something most games do from this point onward, so I'm not going to hold it against them too much. Young Link has next to no deviation in how you progress through his part of the game. And while I guess you can do the Adult Link temples in any order, there is clearly a set path the game wants you to take. And even then, some dungeons need items from other dungeons to beat them. So why would you bother going halfway into a temple, leaving, only to finish an entirely separate area just for the sake of doing things out of order? So, while it isn't perfect, I can certainly see why so many people consider it one of the greatest games ever made. For 1998, this is one of the most ambitious sequels of the period. The sense of adventure and freedom to explore the world set in front of you, nothing at the time could have replicated. And so while it isn't my favourite Zelda game, to deny its quality would be foolish. And hey, its 3DS remake even fixes some of the issues I mentioned. And I apologise for low quality footage here, but recording 3DS gameplay is an absolute nightmare. By tidying up the textures so everything looks nicer, locking on is smoother now than before, and the hand-holding isn't as bad as it once was. So if you want to play Ocarina of Time right now, the 3DS is probably the most enjoyable experience, or at the very least it will be until we inevitably get a Switch port. Other than the N64 card though, Ocarina of Time had its 2 GameCube ports, once in the Collector's Edition and as a pre-order bonus from the Wind Waker. This version also included the previously scrapped Master Quest, a hard version of the original game with enemies hitting harder and remixed dungeons that are definitely a step up from what was in the base game. Ocarina of Time also had a time-limited demo in Smash Bros. Brawl, much like the first Legend of Zelda, before a full Virtual Console release on the Wii and later on the Wii U, and finally 3DS remake in 2011, which also included the Master Quest version to play when you beat the main game. Unfortunately, the next Zelda game after this wouldn't take nearly as long to come out because it recycled a lot of the same models and only had 4 dungeons, the least of any main Zelda game. Next time we better take a look at a rather different Zelda game, and as the younger, more disturbed sibling to Ocarina of Time. Thank you for watching, and good night.